Hey, Sanctus Church, good morning and welcome back, or welcome for the first time. Okay, today we're now turning our eyes formally to the Easter season. We as a church have been doing Lent, and so many of you have been participating in the devotional and talking and praying in connect groups. Great. But today, in the sermon context here, we're now formally preparing ourselves to walk into the holy season. And we're going to start today, I would say, probably in a very unexpected place, and that will become clear as I sort of unfold this. This week, like most of you, I was in my kitchen at one point, and I was, I think, cleaning and dishes and cleaning up the kitchen and all the stuff after the invasion of dinner. And I think I had my iPhone open, and I don't know why this came up on my algorithm in Reels or whatever, but the Antiques Roadshow came up. Now, I've talked about this before. I'm sort of a nerd that way. I love sort of watching history and people discovering history. Anyway, this came up, and it was the middle of washing dishes, and this small reel came up, and it was this woman. So she said, hey, listen, like my dad was stationed in Japan after World War II, and in front of her was this very large, gorgeous ceramic bowl, and she's like, yeah, my dad bought it from a collector, and this is the box. And the guy was like, yeah, actually, that's the original box. It's incredible. That box matches this large ornate bowl. And she's like, yeah, my cat lays in this bowl, and other than that, it's usually underneath my bed, I think she said. And he said, well, actually, this isn't Chinese. This is a Japanese, this isn't Japanese, this is a Chinese bowl, and it's from the 1700s, like 1700, I think he said. And the most avid collectors back then of actually Chinese ceramic were Japanese people. And so it's amazing, it's in such good shape. She's like, yeah, my cat loves it, and I like the look of it. He's like, yeah, it's worth $80,000. And she's just like, I think, I've joked before with our church, I think we're all hoping that underneath our bed, something is like that. And that got me thinking too, when I actually did watch a formal episode of Antiques Roadshow, acting like I'm 90 years old. I watched this guy, and I've never forgotten this, and I went back and found it this week. He brought in a painting of his great-great-grandfather, and it was like in 2014, I think, somewhere around there. It was in the South, like Birmingham, I think. And anyway, the person who was evaluating said, well, how do you get this painting? Oh, this is actually my great-great-grandfather, and actually the artist was a friend of my great-great-grandfather. His name is Frederick Remington. And so it's sort of in a house, and we've passed it down, and we love it as a family. Yeah, and I'll never forget, and the appraiser went, yeah, it's worth $600,000 to $800,000. And you just sort of watch the guy lose his mind. And I guarantee he's like, I know it's a family portrait, but for real, like time to sell the thing. Why I love that show, other than being a little bit of history nerd, is this. I love watching people discover treasure in very unexpected places. It's just, what do you mean? It's in my attic. What do you mean? It's underneath my bed. We've had this for years in our family, and we thought it was junk. I think it's so ugly, and it's worth that much? I think that's the best way for us as a local church, and all of you who watch Beyond Sanctus, for all of us to now walk into Holy Week. Because where we're going to start Holy Week, where we're going to start the holy season, I should say, is actually in a very dark, unexpected place. And interestingly, Jesus chooses to transition his whole ministry in this very unlikely place. Now, when we read it, we won't catch how wild and weird this is. So we're in Matthew chapter 16, verse 13. This is how our journey begins today. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi. Okay, pause. The vast majority of people that lived in Caesarea Philippi were Greek, Syrian, and Roman. This is the border, this town, this region is the border between Jews and non-Jews, what they would say religiously clean and unclean, in and out, with God, against God. So Jesus, as an Orthodox Jew, with his, as a rabbi, with his followers, chooses to go with intention into an unclean area and be discovered in this most unlikely of places. I mean, this is when the greatest treasure is going to be found, in the most unlikely moment. Now, this place, Caesarea Philippi, is profoundly dark. This place had been dedicated to the Roman god Pan, who was half goat, half man. Now, here's how one historian gives us insight in this place. What I'm about to share is actually a little gross, so I'm just giving you sort of like an awareness as I get going. Here's how the historian says it. He says, look, the steep cliff overlooking the city was a home to caves and a natural spring. And by the way, I've been here. It's still there today. You can visit this. Now, he writes this, the deepest crevice of those caves were called or were believed to be the gates of hell or the gates of Hades. The spring that came from the depths of these caves was believed back then to be the place, the mode of transportation from hell, Hades, to earth. Now, 2,000 years ago, they believed. Every year, of course, was different, and the people felt they needed to entice the gods out at the beginning of every spring season to make the harvest plentiful and fruitful. So they did all sorts of sexual acts in front of and in these caves, including, not to be a little over, having sexual relationship with goats, because Pan was half human, half goat. And there are shrines that were all located in this area. So in this area, you have the worship, sexually and otherwise, of Pan. And then, of course, the place is called Caesarea Philippi. It's named after Caesar. People in this region honored Caesar as a god, as the Prince of Peace, and also as Lord. And if you go back in history even more, it gets more interesting, more clarifying, and even darker, because this very site and this very region in the Old Testament was one of the most important central places where the Canaanites used to worship Baal. So in this location, where generations of false worship have taken place, right? Caesar, Pan, Baal, where both human and demonic stuff in the past and present is fully active, it is here in this dark place that Jesus himself chooses to do something massive. Here in this place, he chooses to fully reveal himself and start the journey towards the cross. And I want you to catch this again. A bunch of Orthodox Jews are in a non-Jewish area surrounded by all sorts of darkness, which of course begins to let us know that this is what Jesus is up to, because he's come to overcome darkness and he's come to bring Jew and non-Jew home to God. So let me read it again. Matthew 16:13. When they came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, shouldn't even be there, he asks his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? Okay, we got to pause again. We read the phrase or title, Son of Man, we're like, yeah, Son of Man, he's born of someone. No. This is not a generic phrase or name. Every single Jew knew that this was a huge statement. And to understand the grandness of the phrase, Son of Man, you have to look forward to the end of the Bible, the book of Revelation, and back into the Old Testament to the prophet Daniel. So let's go forward for a second to the book of Revelation, chapter 1. Remember, Jesus' best friend writes this. Revelation 1:10. On the Lord's Day, Sunday, I was in the Spirit. I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet. Verse 12. I turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me. And when I turned around, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And among the lampstands was someone like the Son of Man, dressed in a robe, reaching down to his feet with a golden sash around his chest. Okay, got that? Okay, now let's go back hundreds of years before Jesus comes on the scene. Daniel 7. This is a vision Daniel has. Ready? He says, as I looked, Daniel 7:9, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days, that's God, took his seat. His clothing was white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire. Its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing out before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 by 10,000 stood beside him. And the court was seated and the books were opened. Verse 13. In my vision at night, this is Daniel, I looked and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days, who was led into his presence, and the Son of Man was given authority, glory, sovereign power. All the nations and people of every language, worshipped him. Worship the Son of Man, not the Ancient of Days. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. His kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So what Daniel saw so long ago is fully understood later in the book of Revelation. The Ancient of Days, it's a name for God, and the Son of Man is Jesus. Now, the wild thing, side note, is when you read Revelation chapter 1 and 2, the Father and Son are presented as equal, and the descriptions of the Ancient of Days in Daniel, in Revelation 1 and 2, are actually used for Jesus. And every Jew would get this because they'd go, oh my goodness, the powerful statement. We see the Ancient of Days, God, fully through the Son of Man, Jesus, and somehow, though they're separate, they're one. But we're farther away from Daniel, but we're not yet at the book of Revelation. And the seeds of this whole conversation start getting clarified right here in Caesarea Philippi, surrounded by darkness. This is the page-turning moment between the bookends of Daniel and Revelation. And don't forget, of course, John himself, who writes Revelation, is here for this. Okay, let's go back to the verse again. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They're all like, "Ooh." They reply, interestingly, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others say Jeremiah, others say one of the other Old Testament prophets. So some are saying, Jesus, you're so epic, you're like Elijah. Now, Elijah was the greatest miracle worker of the Old Testament. That makes sense. Other people are like, yeah, no, you're an amazing preacher. You're like John the Baptist who was just murdered. Maybe you are him, come back from the dead. Other people are like, no, I think you're Jeremiah. Now, that's intriguing because Jeremiah, you might not know this, was called by God to go to the Jewish leadership in his day and tell them that God was going to judge the Jewish leadership and destroy the Jewish temple. And he, Jeremiah, was resisted by God's own people and God's own leaders, which of course is what's just about to happen with Jesus. Others say you're one of the other prophets. Now, of course the average Jewish person was thinking Jesus was like or was one of these people. I mean, Jesus had fed 5,000 men, it was over 10,000 people, with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. He healed the blind, he healed the sick, he touched people with leprosy, it disappeared. People had been bleeding for 12 years, he touched them, it's gone. People who were dead, he brought back from the dead. He cast out demons with great power. He powerfully preached. So they were like, oh my goodness, this has to be one of the prophets. Maybe it is literally one of the prophets. But what we catch here is no one in the outside world guessed his true nature. And let's just do a little rabbit trail here. And nothing has changed. Many of us sitting today, listening to this, maybe you're watching online, or you're listening to this years later, maybe you're at one of our sites or our virtual site. Our family, our friends, our neighbors, our enemies, they have all sorts of views of Jesus. Some of us gathered here are unreligious, you're skeptical, you're seeking, you don't believe anything. Others are spiritual or mindful. Others are part of other religions. Lots of us who attend Sanctus are Christian in name only, but we haven't really met Christ. And the truth is, among all of those people, plus all of our relatives and everything we see online, people talk and reflect on Jesus all the time. They say, oh, Jesus was a great man. Muslims say, oh, he was a prophet. He was a great miracle worker. People say he's one form of God. He was an inspired humanitarian. He was a historic revolutionary, a person of historical significance, a gifted religious leader, a moral compass in a broken world. All these options are always given about Jesus. But then the real question comes. And Jesus himself asks it in verse 15. But what about you? What about you? Who do you say that I am? See, Jesus continually comes personally to us and moves us from reflection or us putting words in his mouth or armchair theology to an uncomfortable dialogue with him. Now, interestingly, in the original context, the first guy that speaks is the leader of the group, Peter. Verse 16, Simon Peter answered to Jesus, you're the Messiah, you're the Son of the living God. Peter moves from wrong understanding or partial understanding or imposed understanding to full confession. You're not just a prophet. You're not just a spiritual teacher. You're not just a political revolutionary. You're not just one incarnation of God. You're not just one great religious teacher among many. You're not just one path to God. You're not crazy. You're not just one of the prophets. You're not a liar. You're not Satan the deceiver. You're the Messiah. You're the long-awaited hope of Israel. You're the Son of the living God. You're the only one that has seen God face to face because you came from eternity. You and the Father are one. You can speak with authority stemming from yourself because your identity is grounded in your relationship with the Father. You are basically God in flesh, Emmanuel with us. And I love that he says, Son of the living God. I love this confession in Caesarea Philippi. In that very place, and by the way, there's a good chance they're literally in front of those caves or near them. He basically says, you're not like Baal or Pan or Caesar. You're living. You're the Son of the living God. You're not some dead thing or some human politician. Well, Jesus' response, really intriguing. He says in verse 17, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by humans, by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. You are blessed because God himself chose to show you, Peter, who I actually am." Everyone was guessing, but it takes God to show us who Jesus is. God showed this to you, Simon. You didn't catch this. Lean in, everyone. You didn't understand this because you're more open. You didn't get this because you're more intellectual. You weren't more open or understanding because you saw me heal or cast out demons or give the Sermon on the Mount. People always say all the time, if I would just see Jesus personally, if I just saw his miracles, I'd believe. No. Those who were there, they still didn't even get it. It takes God himself to open our eyes to see Jesus, because we cannot do it because we're spiritually dead, we're in spiritual bondage, we're blind, we're sinful, and God sovereignly has to cut through this, even with those that hung out with him, to see Jesus properly. So Jesus basically says in this really epic moment, he says, "You've declared some really profound things about me which are true." He says, "Now I'm going to do the same to you." And then it happens in Matthew 16:18. "I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell," he looks right over the caves, "will not overcome it." Okay, Jesus doesn't call him Simon anymore, which means the Lord hears, or the Lord has heard. He says, "Your name is Peter." Now, Peter is a Greek form of an Aramaic name, which just means rock. So this is how this reads. "You that are a rock, or our rock, on this rock I will build my church." Okay, what in the world does that mean? And everyone just take a look at the screen, listen to this, it's important. There are three ways to read this. The first one is this: Jesus will build his church on Peter, because he's the first leader. So it reads like this: "You, Peter, are rock," and Jesus is pointing at Peter, "and on you, rock, Peter, I will build my church." So the emphasis is on Peter as rock. The second option is Jesus says, "Hey, Peter, I will build on this rock," and points to himself and not Peter. In other words, he says, "Yes, Peter, you're rock, but actually I'm the more important rock." So he's not pointing at Peter, he's pointing at himself. And interestingly, years later, when Peter was writing his own letters to Christians about Jesus, he says this in 1 Peter 2:4. "As you come to Jesus, the living stone, the living rock, rejected by people, chosen by God, precious to him." So interesting, maybe Jesus means himself. The third way to read this is, "Your confession, Peter, is the rock I will build my church on." The confession is actually the rock, not you personally. So the question is, which one is it? Is it Peter? Is it Jesus? Is it Peter's confession? The natural reading of this and the wordplay, it's about Peter. Now, the Roman Catholic Church has taken this way to an extreme, in my opinion, and they've built the whole papacy out of this. I mean, this is why, I don't know if you know this, the popes are called, the next in line to Peter. What we do know here for sure, and you can see it all through the New Testament, Peter is a first among equals. He is the first Christian leader. There is no doubt about it. Now, this gets more interesting in verse 18. He says, "I tell you, Peter, on this rock, I will build my church." Okay, this is the first time the word church is used in Matthew. Now, church, by the way, ekklesia, that's the Greek word, it just means the assembling of people. It was a normal secular Greek word. In Jewish writings, when it was religious, it meant people of God. So this is what's sort of wild, sitting right beside the gates of hell and Pan and all this uncleanness and an amazing confession. Jesus says the true people of God are my people. And by the way, in the original language, the emphasis is on mine. And this is scandalous and shocking and wild, because basically Jesus is saying, I am the place where Jews and non-Jews become the people of God. It's not by ethnicity, it's by me. And I'm going to do this, it's by my authority. And what is he? He's basically saying, because I'm the Messiah, I'm the Son of the living God, I'm the fulfillment of the Old Testament. I'm going to do this. Which of course becomes the foundation of our whole understanding about church, which Paul later says in Ephesians 2:19, you're no longer foreigners or strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people, members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. Mine. Okay, let's read it again. Jesus says in Matthew 16:18, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome my church. So Jesus, I want you to catch this, is literally looking at the caves where Pan is worshipped in really evil, disgusting ways. And he says, that stuff, the literal gates to the underworld, they have no authority in the end. Now, the gates of hell, or the gates of Hades, is a metaphor for death. The gates are not able to be opened. There's no way out. Death has the final say. And not only that, then you need to ask the question, well, who owns death? If you have a spiritual worldview, not just a secular or a scientific only worldview, well, beyond just physically dying, who owns death? Well, we see this in Hebrews 2:14. When we talk about Jesus sharing our humanity, he said, Jesus too shared in their humanity so that by his death, he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. See, this is what Jesus is saying. He's literally been confessed. He's sitting there with Peter, James, John, and the others. He points over to this pagan shrine area, and he says, death will not have the final say, and the demonic will not have the final say. The gates of hell, they will not overcome my church. And why is he saying this? Because he says, I know what I'm about to do. And then he looks at Peter, and then he says these really profound things. He says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Oh my goodness. Whatever you bind on earth, you will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Now, interestingly, again, if you have any Catholic background, that's why Catholics say all popes are the successor of Peter and have unique authority. And if you go to many Catholic churches, or if you've ever looked at the Vatican flag, it has keys. Why? Because they would say Jesus uniquely gave Peter the keys to the kingdom. The problem with that is 2 chapters later, Jesus says the same thing again to all of them, not just Peter. Matthew 18:18, I tell you the truth, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth, you'll loose in heaven. So there is no doubt, let's make no mistake, Peter is the first leader of our movement. No doubt. He is a first among equals, no doubt. But see, this conversation about binding and loosing, right, is connected to who gets in. Who opens the door to get you into the kingdom of heaven? Now, Peter is the first to know by revelation that Jesus is the one that allows us to come home. And all this gets clear when we understand what binding and loosing is and what it's not. If you come from a more Pentecostal tradition, you've heard all the time this is about binding and loosing and getting blessing or casting out demons. It has nothing to do with that. This was a very common idea among Jewish rabbis 2,000 years ago. It was about authority, no doubt. But binding and loosing was a phrase used by rabbis to say what's yes, what's no, what's allowed, what's not allowed, or actually what it was really about is who gets in and who doesn't get in. In other words, the heart of this conversation is, by what terms or conditions does God allow entrance by humans into his kingdom or not allow entrance into his kingdom? How do you get in? And if you read this passage in Matthew 18, you'll realize it's all about sin and it's all about salvation. Peter is the first one to point to Jesus as the one that allows entrance into the kingdom. Through Jesus, you get entrance into the kingdom. That's the door-opening event. That's the key. Binding and loosing is not about demons. It's access to relationship. That is why you can just draw the line. In Acts chapter 2, which we just finished studied together as a community, when Peter preaches the very first Christian sermon on Pentecost, right, to all these Orthodox Jews, he says, you get home only through Jesus Christ. Binding and loosing, opening the door. That's why Peter also ends up in Cornelius' house, the Roman centurion, which was mind-blowing, and he says to this occupier, this Roman soldier and his whole household, the only way you get home, is through Jesus Christ. In other words, the door-opening event is the same for both communities. Binding and loosing is connected to the forgiveness of sin, and you can only get forgiveness of sin through Jesus, and that's how you come home. Well, after this you're like, oh my goodness, oh my goodness, oh my goodness moment. It's like, again, the Antiques Roadshow. This is worth $2.5 million. Everyone's like, oh my goodness. Then he ordered, verse 20, his disciples not to tell anyone he was the Messiah. Why? Well, here's why. The Jewish hopes for the Messiah back then were really messed up. They kept getting lured back to wrong thinking and wrong desires. We've talked about this. The Jews 2,000 years ago wanted a territorial kingdom, a national kingdom, a political kingdom. They thought Jesus is here and he's the Messiah. And what is the Messiah going to do? He's going to wipe out the Romans with fire from heaven. He's going to destroy all the enemies of the Jews. He's going to deal with every corrupt pastor and Pharisee and Sadducee, and he's going to make Israel great again. He's going to make everything right. He's going to immediately establish Israel at the center of the world by religious authority and by military might. And Jesus comes along and says, no. My kingdom is about suffering, not power. And it's in that order. Suffering leads to God-given power. Well, verse 21, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of elders, chief priests, teachers of the law, that he must be killed on the third day, be risen to life or raised to life. Now, this verse, Peter then took Jesus aside. Peter takes Jesus to the principal's office and rebukes him. Never, Lord. This will never happen to you. Stop talking like this. He's just confessed Jesus as the Son of the living God and the Messiah. And this is what Peter's saying. You will not be taken out by the religious leaders. You will not be taken out by Rome. This is not God's will for you. This is not your job. We know what your job is, so stop talking like this. It's about might and power and victory. You don't need to suffer. You just need to win. Now, in that moment, Jesus can see what's wandering over from those caves. Jesus is watching Satan, Baal, Pan come into the room. And whether you understand or not, at that moment, Satan is deeply influencing Peter, probably to the point of some filling the rock, right after his amazing confession. Satan always tries to kill things before they can be born. This, by the way, is the first betrayal of Jesus by Peter, not his trials. Because Peter is already making a handshake with the devil. He's already giving in to the devil, even though Jesus has just declared the devil would not fully be able to destroy the church, thank God. But like we saw in the book of Acts, this is a turf war taking place again. Now, this language might feel a little familiar to some of you if you've read Matthew, and it should. See, when Jesus started his ministry at 30 years old, he was tempted by the devil 40 days, 40 nights in the wilderness. And the devil, by the way, is Baal, and the devil is Pan, by the way, and the devil deeply is connected to Caesar's world. And what did the devil say to Jesus at the end of the temptations? Oh, he came to Jesus and he said, you don't need to suffer. You don't need to suffer. I mean, this is what he said in Matthew 4:8. The devil took him to a high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and all their splendor. Remember, the devil owns all of this, so he could legitimately offer it to Jesus. And even after Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, what does 1 John 5:19 say? The whole world is under the control of the evil one. All the color, all the military, all the food, all the sexual pleasure in any direction, all the treasure, all physical reality, Satan owns it. And the goal by Satan was to get Jesus to be king the wrong way. This was to attack his identity, to bypass call. God, by the way, had already promised Jesus the whole world, all the way back in Psalm chapter 2, one of the Messianic Psalms, Psalm 2:7. I proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you're my son. Today I have become your father. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance. The ends of the earth will be your possession. See, the goal of Satan is to give the earth, the nations, all authority in heaven, on earth, to Jesus, the Son of Man, without the mission of the cross and without the establishment of the church. So Satan says in Matthew 4, you can be king. You should be powerful. You don't need to suffer. Be in control. Be self-made. You don't need to suffer to follow God or his commands. You don't need to suffer. There's an easier way out. There's a more fulfilling way. You actually deserve this. He says in verse 9, I'll give all this to you if you just bow down and worship me. And Jesus said, away from me, Satan. It is written, worship the Lord God and serve him only. The phrase is, you get to be king the wrong way. And oh, by the way, you don't need to suffer and you don't need to build the church. Now that's all the way back in Matthew 4. Now we're all the way here. And the offer is given again right beside the gates of hell. And Jesus says, verse 21, I must be killed, and on the third day I will be raised to life. Verse 22, Peter takes him aside and rebukes Jesus. Never, Lord, this will never happen to you. And how does Jesus respond to Peter? Shocking. Verse 23, Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. Uh-oh. You're a stumbling block to me. You do not have the mind. You have you do not have in mind the concerns of God. You just have merely human concerns. Peter, Jesus says, the gates of hell and the gates of the demonic will not overcome my church, but you already are compromised within seconds of right confession and revelation by God, and you don't even know it. So Satan, and he literally speaks to Peter and speaks to what's influencing Peter at the same time. Your offer? No. Your temptation? No. Peter? No. Your influence? No. I will suffer. I will die. This is the will of my Father. The church will be born. You will not overcome me, Satan. And in the end, all this, you're going to be destroyed. And then it's like the scene closes. Now that is a lot of treasure in a very dark, unexpected place. Now, as we're entering not into Holy Week yet, but into the Holy Season more formally, there's so much to help us in this passage. So, number one, who do people say the Son of Man is? This is the greatest question and the most important question in all of history. See, Jesus, by his deeds, self-declaration, and teaching, claimed to be the Son of God, claimed to be God in flesh. But then he comes along and he asks you personally, right now, no matter what site you're at, what podcast you're listening to, wherever you're hearing this in the world, he's asking you personally, who do you say that I am? And by the way, some of you listening, I have a sense of this as I was praying and prepping. Some of you are like, I am Caesarea Philippi. I would be the most unexpected place to find Jesus. I love what C.S. Lewis once penned, which became so famous for him. He said, a man who is merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He'd either be a lunatic on the level with a man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make a choice. Either this man Jesus was and is the Son of God, or a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit on him and kill him as demonic. You can fall at his feet and claim him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about him being a great human teacher. He has not left that option for us. He did not intend to leave that option for us. So as we dive in to this holy time, thinking about the life and the suffering and the death and resurrection of Jesus, for all of you who are skeptical or spiritual or from another faith or Christian but not really, or spiritual, you must wrestle with what Jesus claimed about himself. You can't put words in his mouth. You can't make him what you want him to be. Who do you say he is? Who do you say he is? I want to say to the many of us who are Christians gathering, I just want to remind us, death does not have the final say. The demonic do not have the final say. The church, with all of its struggles and all that we're facing in culture, it will not be overcome. Jesus' victory is total. It is final. He has won. He will fully win. And I think we need like the air in our sails. It doesn't matter what happens in the world. Jesus declares this. The gates of hell will not win, will not prevail. Death for us, though terrible, not the final say. The demonic do not win in the end. the church will persevere because Jesus is the one who's building it. That brings me to, I think, probably the most important point as we navigate and turn to prepare. Jesus, because of who he is so worthy of worship. He's worthy of our lives. I mean, just think about this. He's overcome Satan. He's overcome death. He's promised us the gates of hell will not prevail because of him. He's allowed binding and loosing so we actually get to come home and be part of the kingdom of heaven. He's involved us even now in the process of allowing other people to come home. And there's hope. I mean, there's just hope. And I love how Jesus does this in Caesarea Philippi, in the darkest, weirdest place, to remind us, even in the darkest place, we're still home. But let me make this very practical now to Sanctus. That's why next week's gathering on Palm Saturday is so key. And if you don't know, next week we're going to gather on, not Sunday, on Saturday, as one church together. All 5 of our locations are going to come together. It's awesome when we get together. There'll be thousands of us together. It's a big family reunion. We get to see people we haven't seen in years. You get to meet all sorts of other people who belong to our community that you don't know. And it's great, and it's good, and it's right. But that's not why I'm saying this. For weeks, I would say probably 4 or 5 weeks, I have not been able to get by the sense that Jesus has decided to come closer to our church than usual as we're going to gather intentionally to confess him, like Peter did as Messiah, Son of God, and pour our worship to our King. And he's not going to do it, by the way, because there's more people in the room. I'm not talking about this because it's bigger or it's a better venue than some of our other venues, or all our venues, actually. It's better than all of it, or the technology's better, or the excellence of what. That's all fine. But that's not why I'm saying this. I'm not saying this I have no time for hype anymore. I'm just too old and tired. This is not about hype. This is not about numbers. I just have this profound sense that when we get together on Palm Saturday, and we confess Jesus like Peter did, rightly, he's going to meet us in a pretty unique way. And I just want to tell you this so you can start preparing your heart and praying and come expectant. And I think also, maybe we just need to remember what Jesus said. Jesus says, as I'm lifted up, I'll draw all people to myself. There's something about that, and there's something about the gathering, and there's something about this right confession that is converging into something quite beautiful. So I want to give hope, but I also want to give encouragement. Like, when we gather together, I think the Lord's going to do something special, not because we're just doing something bigger. I think this is going to be a moment where we encounter Jesus uniquely, and it should just build some real excitement among us. So let's maybe pray into the holy season like this. Thank you, Jesus, for coming and setting us free from our darkness. Thanks for walking into all of our Caesarea Philippis, the demonic, death, sin, lostness, blindness, and letting us see you as Messiah and Son of God. We pray for those who are wrestling, who don't know you yet. Open their eyes like you did Peter in the next few weeks. For all of us, we claim again, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. We declare it as a church. And then we're just going to ask again, not for hype, not for emotionalism, not for manipulation. Jesus, by your Spirit, under God the Father's will, would you meet Sanctus Church in that gathering so we can confess you and honor you right, and prepare then for Good Friday and then Easter. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.